I was in Kagbini in the Mustang district of Nepal, a region shaped by both slow moving climate shifts and sudden shocks like the devastating floods of 2023. While there, I sat down with Amina Maharjan, a senior specialist at the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. Amina works on migration and resilience and has spent years across the Hindu Kush Himalaya, particularly with mountain communities facing increasing climate risks. Her work challenges dominant crisis narratives and reframes migration as a strategy for adaptation grounded in people's choices, knowledge, and lived experiences. Her research brings a deep understanding of what resilience looks like on the ground. In this conversation, she shared insights from the field and what it means to support communities already adapting in complex and powerful ways. Amina, you have spent years working in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region. What first drew you to this line of work and what keeps you going?
See, I have always been very passionate about mountains. I've been born here, brought up here. I'm very close to. And working at ISIMO the last decade, what fascinates me is the resilience of people, but then the rapidity of change that they are having to, deal with. And that's something, and in a way, that unfairness of it. People who have, lived with nature, with their own system of knowing for such a long time, have been completely thrown into a mess, so to say, and nothing to do with them. Mostly it's the global changes that's happening, the globalization forces, the climate change, and how the communities have been still grappling with it. And that's what really motivates me to work in this region.
Migration is often framed as a crisis, but your work challenges the idea and says it is adaptation. What made you see it differently?
See, if you look into high mountains always had these multi-local livelihoods. We are visiting now here in Kagbeni. If you look at the topography, depending on the resources locally for survival, forget about even, social mobility, it's simply not possible. So multi-local livelihoods is part and parcel of mountain life. I still remember my conversation with somebody from here actually, said that if you need to understand mountain people, and particularly people from Mustang and down below Thakalis, that two things are very integral: mobility and entrepreneurship. Without this, we cannot survive in mountain. So I was very clear that migration is not a challenge, but it can actually be a huge part of the solution. But because it has been framed, the dominant narrative has been framed as a challenge, I feel that a lot of potential for catalyzing migration for development has been missed out. And similarly, the narrative in migration and adaptation.
We are right now in Kagbeni, which saw devastating floods in 2023. Now, what did the aftermath reveal about adaptation here? Could you tell me a bit about that?
So, Sophia, it's a good point that you have raised. In 2023, that was a devastating flood. Luckily, no loss of life, but lots of economic losses. I have met a young person who had mentioned that all 3 houses, they lost their family, right? So magnitude of loss is massive. I've also met a lady who, in an event actually, who was asking that, had invested, she was on migration, both couple, more than 10 years, and I have invested all that money to build a hotel, and that is gone now. And the question she asked was, what should I do? I have some resources left, should I rebuild it or should I re-migrate? And if you look at Kagbeni's story, it was devastating loss, very heartbreaking, but then they did not lose out on the tourism season. They were very much clear that would be even more bigger loss for them. And the kind of social mobilization that they have done, the diaspora helping out, and not only in terms of money, but also in kind, like cooking food and bringing here, also coming here to clear the debris. And that kind of, that story itself is a story of mobility, social network, not only within the Mustang, but also beyond. The diaspora who are living in US or in Europe, they were of massive help for the community to rebuild after the flood. And I think that's an excellent case of how, mobility can be catalyzed. Now, having said that, I'm not saying that mobility is the only way. A lot of people here have decided not to move. So there is also a mobile population. Within the communities here, there is a very strong sense of care. So in the family, like one brother decides to stay back so that they can look after the land, the parents who don't want to move, whereas others are then left to go, and that kind of understanding. So not only mobility, there's also a story of immobility, but then that immobility and the aspiration for social mobility becomes possible because somebody is allowed to move out.
In fragile mountain regions where water and land are critical, what does adaptation in the future of livelihoods look like?
I think that's a question in the minds of many people here. And obviously, as a person who works on the intersection of mobility as well as adaptation, that's a question I ask myself. And increasingly, what's becoming common is, climate change impacts farming or livestock keeping. These sectors much more higher than others. So I think moving forward, if you look into rural future in mountain, or for that matter, even in other ecological systems, there would be need to diversify livelihoods beyond farm-based sectors, because I believe there is a lot of resilience in farming that can be achieved through technology, through better information, better marketing. But looking at the pace of change, the climate change impacts that we are looking, I think it's going to be important to also look into non-farm sectors, whatever that is. That can be, for instance, tourism could be one of them. And this is what in many mountains they have, like integrating tourism with farm and other. So migration and remittances are going to be important. But what could be that other sources? For instance, now with education levels increasing, is there a future where people can, this virtual work, digitalization, is there a future? So I think these kind of exploration needs to be, acutely sought into for a more resilient livelihoods in mountain rural areas.
In this project, you're looking at climate resilient livelihoods, mobility, and circular migration. Could you share some early insights from fieldwork on mobility and resilient livelihoods?
What was fascinating for us is migration is, everybody understands that there is migration, internal, international. Everybody understands that the impacts of climate change is increasing, the adaptation needs and the gaps. Everybody talks about it. But it's interesting that the moment we start to look into solutions, programs, plans, then mobility is completely absent. So we have done these foresight exercises where we are asking, stakeholders to just draw what they feel their village looks like. People talk about mobility, but then in nowhere there the migrants are seen. So that absence of migrant population is something fascinating. And this is then reflected in the programs, interventions, plans, and not only at local, but also at national level. And this is something that we as a project want to look into. How do you bring this mobility into the plan? In origin, how do you make them more mobility responsive? In destination where a lot of migrants are going, they are also not getting the services. So how do you include them, right? Because at the end of the day, when you're talking of internal migration, everybody is a citizen. So that basic rights you have, but even in international migration, certain basic human rights that you cannot ignore. So how do you bring this is something that we really look forward to, and also help the government, local government mostly, because that's where we are working very closely, help them to integrate this. Because it's not like they don't want to at the moment, because there is no, in the very mindset, it's not there. So we need to bring that. And that's something that, it's an ambition that we look forward to fulfilling within the project life.
You have said migration can build resilience. How have you seen that play out here in Kagbini or across Nepal?
I think the first point is this disconnect between what people think and often choose as a adaptation or a livelihood strategy vis-a-vis how government or other non-government institutions are thinking. I think that breeze needs to be, it's very important. And I believe it is possible. My experience with international migration, it took a long journey, but that acceptance came. And I think in internal migration, this is a similar kind of discussion that we need to have. Through success, that's going to be an initiation, but hopefully, our institution, for instance, Isimoti, he's here, and we hope we continue to work on this. It should be possible. Because the moment we start to realize, where people are going, what kind of skill, because there is a huge skill mismatch. You have employers seeking, people, workers, and for workers not finding jobs. A lot of these mismatches can be addressed when you have a better handle of migration. Right now, except for census, and these are also not happening very regularly in our region, it's very difficult to understand the migrant population. And this is something, at least the local governments have actually flagged, that yes, I need to serve, but I need to know how many people am I serving? Because the census says 50,000, but I can easily count at least 30,000 households. So how do I serve when I don't even know how many? So I think that's the first step that needs to be taken. Once you have a better handle of people's need, then addressing that becomes easier. And COVID, very unfortunate pandemic, but it has also opened some of those because of that visibility of migrants really happened when people were stuck and had to take that very long journeys, right? That also, I think, opened up the need of that invisible migrant workers. And I think more continuous work needs to be done in that front. And that way, then migration can actually lead to development, better, resilient livelihood systems, not both in origin, destination, both sides.
Adaptation looks very different on paper than it does in practice. What are the patterns of inequality that shape it most?
See, it's like with development, these differences happen. So even though climate change impacts everybody, the way they experience it really differs. And in our case, caste is very important, but also gender. And in migration, I say that generation is something we cannot forget. Because most of the migrants, it's young people. Whereas, older people want to stay put. And this is something we were having a discussion that, it's probably a very natural instinct, but because place attachment for a younger generation vis-a-vis older people is very different. Because older people start to think, okay, we are coming to an end of the journey, so we want to stay. But for young people, it's not like they want to completely detach from the place, but they feel like, okay, let me explore, and maybe I come back, right? So that generation also becomes very important. But then migration, interestingly, it also opens up to, raise some of those discriminations, some of those inequities. For instance, if the men are migrating, women get better space for decision making, which otherwise might not be possible. Similarly, even when people are migrating, for instance, lower caste, Dalit people in case of Nepal, like they're having better say. Better wages, also having access to land and other assets. So those are possible. But the thing is, how do you really catalyze that to make that positive change? This is where more thought needs to be made.
Migration and climate change are often treated separately. How can researchers and policymakers then connect the dots?
So, see, migration is always going to be multiple driver. It's not going to be one factor, leading to migration. And those drivers are going to be dynamic. It will keep changing over place and over time. I think we need to have that clarity. But having said that, what's also becoming clear is now with the climate change impacts getting more severe, more extreme, climate change impacts itself is also is as a primary driver, it's coming up slowly. But this is just beginning that we are seeing. But probably in future, it's very probably that climate change becomes one of the major driver for migration. At the moment, it is still economic employment. That's important. Secondly, in some cases, displacement. When you have climate-induced disasters, displacements are happening. There, it's very clear. It's climate as the major driver. But I think in all of this, what is important and what is missing is the potential of migration for adaptation. So this is what is not being spoken so much. When you are talking about climate migration, most people are stuck on climate-induced migration, and that does not help. And climate-induced migration, again, if you look into general narrative, the general understanding is people would move in huge numbers from global south to global north. Again, there is no evidence of that happening. Most of the climate, where climate is a primary driver, the migration is happening within the country, so internal migration. I think these are few things which has been, there is no evidence to back up, but this has been continued as a dominant narrative. And this has been more, it does more harm than good. Because when that happens, then the whole border control, securitization, all of that happens, that is more negative. But if we focus more on how do you capitalize, because yes, people would move for multiple reasons. Most of that mobility is happening within the country. And in case of South Asia, a large chunk of that is happening within the region. I was just looking at that data. A very strong, if you're talking about labor migration, a chunk of it is going to Gulf countries. So global North per se, very limited and high skilled, right? So I think our focus should be on how do you catalyze migration for adaptation? Because if this, again, something that has stayed very strongly in my mind is when adaptation needs, and this is something we have found in two of our reports that ICIMOD has done for the assessment reports that ICIMOD has done in the HKS region. Most of that adaptation is autonomous at family or community scale and incremental, which means to say the burden of adaptation is with households and communities. If that is the case, I mean, it's very logical that the government starts to think of supporting the families and the communities in their chosen adaptation pathway. And this is where that disconnect is at the moment. And this is where the potential of migration, leveraging migration for adaptation is missing. Now, there is also a narrative which says that no, by migration, you're putting the burden of adaptation on migrants. But that we are doing it anyways. So is it not more logical that if that's what the families, the individuals, communities have chosen, then whatever support the government is doing, which is normally very limited, 10-20%, right? Can you help in that direction? So that, that migration outcome is actually positive, and that leads to better adaptation. I think that's the narrative that needs to be more strengthened, and more evidence needs to be generated on that front.
After years of working in this space, what is your hope for how we address climate-linked migration?
Very simple. I hope that our plans, policies become more mobility responsive, mobility inclusive. And it's not a big ask. I don't think it's a big ask. Because at the end of the day, as I said, in our region, most of this mobility is happening internally. So trying to meet the needs, adaptation needs or development needs of citizens, that should be every government's top agenda. So that's what I would say. Stop thinking in silos, be it especially like urban, rural, whereas these are so connected. Stop thinking that. Stop thinking in silos. And this is where I think migration also helps us understand. When people decide to move, they are thinking of reducing their overall vulnerability. They are not thinking of reducing vulnerability in agriculture sector or livestock sector or this and that. The whole thinking of the household is how do I reduce vulnerability to climate change, or how do I, meet my development aspiration? That holistic thinking. How can I transfer my livelihood, or my life, or the entire lifestyle? And if households are thinking that way, if our governance system can also align more on that line, and that I think is where that win-win situation actually happens, and that's my hope. And I hope I hope this is a very practical hope that can be achieved soon.
Amina's work shows us that resilience is not a single solution, but an ongoing process layered with complexity, shaped by inequality, and powered by community strength. Her insights challenge us to rethink migration and adaptation, not as separate issues, but as deeply connected human stories. She reminds us that communities are not just coping, they are adapting in smart and powerful ways. As climate risks grow, her work shows us that adaptation is already happening, often led by the very people most affected.